Jussie Smollett, he's currently on trial in Cook County, which is in Illinois, for staging a hate crime.
Right.
I haven't talked a lot about this case at all because it's super complicated. And I totally, for some folks, it's not complicated. He's pretty much already been judged by the court of public opinion saying he staged this hate crime. But then I saw Angela Davis. And when Angela Davis talks, I listen. And she said this: don't uncritically believe the police in Jussie's case. So no matter what y'all think about Jussie Smollett, I just want you to hear me out, and then I want David Henderson to break it down for us as well. Because as y'all know, every Wednesday, I do a segment on my show called Exonerated. And I interview people who have been wrongfully convicted, and they are either fighting to be exonerated or they are exonerated. And I've learned so much, David, in this year, I think over a year at this point, of doing my Exonerated series, of what happens to people when they get caught up in the system, what they can or cannot do, and what happens when you have prosecutors who are overzealous in what they'll do. So as I was researching the Jussie Smollett case and just going beyond, he's been trending on social media for over 2 days at this point. And people on the right are all over it. They are Fox News, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, they are all over it. So again, I don't know who is innocent or who is guilty. But what I do know is that I do want a Black man in Chicago to get a fair trial. And there are some key things that I want to bring up, David. One thing that made my jaw drop, and I've seen barely anybody report on this, is according to the Associated Press, on Monday, a security guard named Anthony Moore said that around the time of the alleged assault, he saw 2 men running from the scene. But Moore said when he was questioned by the special prosecutor, he felt pressure to change his story. And he testified that he signed a statement that said the person was possibly a Black man, but that he felt, quote, pressure and threatened to put something out there that I didn't see, unquote. So David, when I see that, a witness feeling pressured and threatened by a special prosecutor, my spidey senses are going off the chain at that point. That deeply concerns me. And I have seen that over and over in cases where people are wrongfully convicted. All right. There's a couple other things that I want you to take it. The jury in Cook County for this trial with Jussie Smollett only has 1 Black juror. 1 Black juror. That confuses me because this area is 26% Black. Why is there only 1 Black juror on this case? And one might say, well, is there really a racial element? Because, you know, the 2 people who were a part of this hate crime, allegedly, they were Black, they were of Nigerian descent. But when you see the way that the right is attaching themselves to the story, and when you see the racial implications with Trump and somebody, you know, allegedly one of the guys screamed, "This is Trump country," whatever, MAGA country. There are some racial political implications there. And Jussie is a Black man in the system under Chicago. So that's concerning for me as well. Then lastly, Judge James Lynn has a fascinating history that nobody is talking about. He has been blocked from being over any sex offender cases because he was famously reversing the verdict of juries, meaning the sentencing. And there's one man in particular, a white man who assaulted a Black woman, and the jury found him guilty and gave him a particular sentence, and the judge reversed that ruling. And people were confused by this. He's been on the court, on the bench for 30 years. They were confused by this. So they have blocked him from being on sex offender cases because he reversed a jury that found a white man guilty, a jury's verdict rather, who assaulted a black woman. And then reportedly, Tamara Walker, one of Jussie's attorneys, accused the judge of physically lunging towards her and snarling at her when they had a sidebar over the trial. That concerns me. And lastly, David, and again, regardless of how you feel, no one is talking about this. I just want people to be aware. This entire case depends on the two Nigerian American brothers. There's no video evidence. These brothers are working with police. We don't know what deals were offered. We don't know. We just don't know. And so when I've covered Exonerated, and when I see an entire case relying on two people who are working with police, that's another red flag for me. I want Jussie Smollett to get a fair trial. And when I'm seeing pressure by the prosecutors, when I'm seeing an entire case with no video evidence, when I'm hearing that he did this because he wasn't getting paid enough, working on the show Empire, but then you find out during this trial, he was getting paid $100,000 per episode, and he actually didn't want that much security around him when a letter was mailed threatening his life. This is concerning me, David. So am I being overly critical? I just think we as Black folks should be aware, but just tell me your thoughts on some of these points that I brought up.
Absolutely, Clay. And you're giving me so much to talk about. It's hard to know exactly where to start. But let me say this, because it's a consistent theme I've noticed in all the conversations that you and I have. And that is, we have very few opportunities as Black people to discuss the experiences we have with the criminal justice system. This takes me back to the very first exposure I ever had was as a child, when there was a woman walking through our neighborhood who decided to take it upon herself to fingerprint young Black men because she was convinced that one of us had broken into her house. But I just remember looking back, thinking about how bold she felt going door to door, demanding that people give their fingerprints because she had taken it upon herself to play the role of the police. And I think that so many of us have experiences like this. And when these types of cases come up in the news, it gives us a very limited opportunity to express ourselves and what our exposure has been to. Let me try to summarize my thoughts by saying this. The case against Jussie Smollett is bad. I'm speaking as a lawyer when I say that. But to your point, the case against the justice system is even worse. Let me try to tie two of the themes that you brought up together. And that was, first, this idea that race may not be an element of this case necessarily. I'm going to go back to one of the themes of critical race theory. Race is always an issue when Black people are on trial. There's never a time when it's not. That's reflected in the limited number of Black jurors that you have who are playing a role in this case, but it's also reflected in something that you said about the judge. It's not simply concerning that the judge is being targeted by prosecutors to be avoided when sexual assault cases come before his court. It's notable that the case that he reversed involved a Black woman who was assaulted by a white man, which is also a component of critical race theory, this idea of intersectionality, specifically when Black women are victims of domestic violence or sexual assaults, they are not treated the same way by the justice system. I have witnessed that firsthand because I was a special prosecutor and I observed that as a repeating theme. The article you sent me about this judge left me wondering that. It left me wondering if we took a look at the cases where prosecutors disagreed with the judge, and how many of those cases was the victim a Black woman where the judge was light when it came to sentencing or punishment, because the article also said prosecutors don't avoid him on other types of serious cases. So now when you combine the fact that the jury is not reflective of the community in terms of Black folks specifically, and let me be frank when I say this, I've tried somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 jury trials at this point in my career. You reach a point where it just gets kind of hard to count, but I can tell you on every single case I have ever tried, if there were Black people who might potentially serve on the jury, there was a fight from one side about trying to exclude them. It happens so often, we have a name for it. It's called bats and challenges. Every single time I've dealt with Black folks potentially being on that jury, one side was trying to fight against them being there. Normally it's the prosecution who's fighting against it in criminal trials. Normally it's the company that's fighting against it in civil trials. And that's just one of the things that you end up having to contend with as a trial lawyer. Again, in sexual assault trials, if the victim, or domestic violence, if the victim is a Black woman, it's really difficult for them to get justice in the court system. But when you've got a judge who's been targeted for that before, it's a double whammy for Jussie Smollett in terms of him getting a fair trial. Now, that's not to say I don't think the evidence against him is bad, because I think it's catastrophic, but it still plays into this idea where you're questioning whether or not his treatment through the justice system is fair. And it's something that as Black folks, we need to talk about, because most of us, this is my experience, most of us have direct exposure to the criminal justice system because either we were wronged or we know someone who was wronged. And so as a lawyer, sometimes I'm talking to people, and if they're not Black or they're not a person of color, they may say, well, this is the way I think it works. And I'm like, okay, there's a difference between you saying you think that's how it works and me saying I know it's how it works, because I've got family and friends who've been through this system and I've seen firsthand how it works. Now I've got more that I could say, but that's a mouthful. I want to make sure I'm addressing what it is you want me to focus on.
No, definitely. That's perfect. And that's a really important setup. Okay, so break down for me this witness saying that he was threatened by the special prosecutor. Again, that terrifies me because that is my exonerated series 101. And
Right.
that leads me to believe things aren't fair. And all I want are for things to be fair for any Black man in the justice system, even someone who's rich and famous like Jussie Smollett. So being threatened, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, here's my first thought, and this is what bothers me most about this case overall. There is absolutely no reason why this case should be at trial. And the reason I say it shouldn't be at trial is because it's a missed opportunity to help people, to help the community, and to focus where attention actually needs to be placed with regard to the criminal justice system. This is a segue. I know it's not directly on point with what you're asking me, but it's a point that needs to be made. In this country, we get over-policed and then we get under-policed. Flav wrote 911 as a joke for good reason for PE back in the day, right? And that's because when we tend to need help and we call for it, the justice system is slow to respond. So here, you're trying Jussie Smollett for making a false claim to the police, which happens every day in every major city. And you're doing that at the expense of trying other cases that need more critical attention. That's problem number one. And I'm saying that because the case was dropped and then it was picked back up. Now, anytime a prosecutor is asking someone about questions in terms of what they're going to testify to on the stand, there should never be an impression left that they are trying to get that person to change their testimony. Prosecutors are the only lawyers in the world who have the sole obligation to pursue justice. And what that means is that even if evidence is bad for you, you're supposed to make sure that it sees the light of day. And so when you're a prosecutor and you sit down and you're talking to a witness, the first words out of your mouth are, look, I just want the truth. Now listen, I've got to ask you some questions about some things because this evidence isn't matching up for me, and I see some holes, and I may have to press you on some things to make sure I understand. But again, I want to make sure that you know the only thing I want from you is the truth. And when I was a prosecutor and I would meet with witnesses, I would say that 10 or 15 times because I don't want there to be any question about where I'm coming from. And that should always be the case when you're talking to a prosecutor. But to your point, we see as a common theme that when people are talking to prosecutors about cases involving Black folks in the criminal justice system, they often walk away thinking that they were trying to be coerced into saying something different. And so to the extent that you're looking for reasons to be concerned, that's a very valid reason to be concerned because it never should be a question. I will offer this caveat, and it's something that you have to be aware of as a lawyer, and I always feel uncomfortable saying this, but it doesn't change the fact that it's true. The truth can sound 3 or 4 different ways depending on how you say it. And so there are times when I am talking to someone about what happened on a case, and I've literally had to tell them. In fact, let me give you a specific example. I worked as a special prosecutor. I remember working on this domestic violence case where this young woman had been assaulted by her boyfriend, and she kept describing the way things happened. And she said, you know, he hit me, then I put him in a headlock. And I had to tell her, look, when you say that you put him in a headlock, that makes me think that you were in control during that part of the physical encounter. And if that's the case, then tell me that, because I need to know. But if you weren't in control, it's distracting when you say that because it gives me a false impression. And if the issue here is that you just don't want to acknowledge everything you went through, that's something we can work through. But I have to have a clear picture of what it was that happened. And that was an example where she said, listen, it's just hard for me to talk about everything he did for me. And I said, I understand that. We can work through that. But that's an example of a time when I challenged someone to try to get at the truth of what happened. It's very different from someone saying, listen, I felt like I had something to say, and this prosecutor told me not to say it. In that situation, as a prosecutor, what you should do is let that person speak their truth, and you even present it to the jury. And if you have to, you go so far as to say, listen, you're going to hear some discrepancies in this person's testimony, and they may even tell you directly that some witnesses didn't agree with their point of view, but it's still important for you to hear it. Because as a prosecutor, that's always what you want people to take away, is that you didn't hide anything, you were upfront. And given the history of our criminal justice system, that is especially important when you've got a person of color on trial.
All right. So the Nigerian American brothers, we found out yesterday that allegedly he had a sexual relationship with one of the brothers, which is not illegal, but break this down for me, and maybe I have this wrong. I think what I'm confused about is that it appears that everything is relying on these two brothers. So I don't know who's telling the truth. And then I would think, well, if they actually did stage a hate crime together, if that's what happened, then wouldn't the brothers have wouldn't they have done something wrong as well too? I mean, I'm just confused on. I don't know if they can be trusted, if they were a part of this crime and allegedly one of them lied about their sexual relationship. But how can it all rely on these two brothers? And if this is the truth, if they all did this together, wouldn't they have some responsibility as well?
See, Clea, I hear two questions, and your second one is even more compelling than your first one. And that is, if they're in on it, then why are they prosecuting Mr. Smollett and not also being prosecuted themselves? But let's go back to that first question, because it's critical. This question, is everything writing on what the two of them say? And this just has to do with trial strategy and how you lay out the story. And I think that you see some problems there. In fact, with all the cases that you see in the news right now, I think what you're really seeing is what trials look like in an era where lawyers never go to trial anymore, and they don't know how best to develop these things. I wouldn't say it rides solely on their testimony, because you've got other facts. To me, the biggest fact that I would have felt like I had to address if I was Mr. Smollett's lawyer is, what's up with this $3,500 payment? Like, you have to explain that check. If you're taking the stand—
He said it was for training. He said it was for
I know he said that,
drugs.
But I don't think that explanation was compelling. And the reason that's important is because you don't have to take the stand in a criminal trial. But if you do take the stand, you get compared to Matlock, and you have to give this jury some alternate theme that explains this crime. I don't think just saying training got you there. This judge hasn't allowed cameras inside the courtroom, so I'm forced to read up on what else he said. But when you also say that part of it is to get a substance when he's taking a trip abroad that you can't buy in the United States, I don't see how that testimony helps you, right? In addition to that, you have to have an explanation for why you wouldn't let the police take a look at your phone, why you didn't want to give a DNA sample. I'm skeptical of those things too, but in the context of this case, that testimony hurts you more than it helps you. But I just want to make sure it's clear that ties into the testimony. So the testimony is only one component of the evidence. But the question, again, that I find even more compelling is, these two brothers are saying that you were in on the crime. So what you are acknowledging is you're every bit as guilty as Mr. Smollett is. So why is it okay to prosecute him based on your testimony, but not also turn the finger back and point it toward you? And if you're his defense lawyer, you want to make that the issue in the trial. And when I look back at his testimony so far, that's not what I get. I see him talking more about how his career developed from being a child actor to a professional actor. I don't know why you ever would think it'd be a good idea to tell 12 hardworking people, which is who ends up serving on the jury, that you get paid $100,000 per episode on Empire. I think that just puts distance between you and the jury, which is the opposite of what you want to do in a case like this. You essentially want to convince them to ignore the law, which happens all the time in trial. And I can give you specific examples of that and how that puts us at a disadvantage when we are at trial. But that's what you want to do more in this case. So to your point, I agree with you, and that should have been developed better on cross-examination.
Absolutely. Do you feel like, considering what we covered today, do you feel like he's getting a fair trial, regardless if he's guilty or innocent, or is something in the milk ain't clean, as I always say?
That's a tough question for me to answer, Clay. And I'm going to be frank with you because I always am. If I walk into a trial and I've got a person of color who's participating in that case, I don't expect for them to get a fair trial. Now, as a lawyer, I can't just complain about that. I have to be able to do something about it in the context of the trial. Otherwise, I'm no good as a lawyer. I'm definitely no good as a civil rights lawyer. But let me put in perspective exactly what I mean when I say this. My wife and I have a friend. She got pulled over for DWI. She took the breath test and she blew over 2 times the legal limit. And she talked to me about her case and she asked me what I thought. And I was still a prosecutor at the time who was in charge of the DWI task force. I knew her lawyer from law school. I got his permission to talk to her. But then once I talked to her, I said, you know what? You should take your case to trial. And she said, they have me dead to rights. Why would I do that? I said, because I've tried enough cases to know a jury is not going to convict you. Now, she is white. That matters in court. She looks great in a suit. That matters in court, whether it's demeaning, condescending or not. Juries care about these things. Sure enough, she went to trial. The officer was aggressive with her on the video, the body cam footage that was recorded. The jury understood that she blew 2 times the legal limit, but they completely acquitted her, did not convict her at all. I knew the prosecutor, he did an exceptional job during the trial. That's just the way the world works. Now, I can't give that same advice to someone who looks like me or you if they're walking inside of a courtroom, but I have to know that if I'm going to do a good job as a lawyer. So overall, do I think that Smollett is getting a fair trial? No, I don't. Do I think the case could have been tried better on his behalf? I absolutely do. And I don't think that a conviction is a fair result, given what it is he's facing with the circumstances under which these events took place.
One more thing before you go. I just want to on this check for $3,500, and you're a lawyer, so maybe I'm just seeing it the wrong way. I just feel like, and maybe I'm looking at it from like just a storyline perspective, if you're going to stage a hate crime, if you're going to go this far, why would it just be $3,500? That sounds like a small amount of money if you're going to this elaborate scenario. And allegedly, according to the Jussie's team, the Nigerian American brothers said, if you give me $1 million, we won't testify against you. I just don't know what's going on, but that $3,500, $3,500, that's split between the two of them. That seems like pennies to do this elaborate staging a hate crime. Even that scenario doesn't make sense to me, but you think it does kind of make sense.
Now, hear me out. I'm not saying it makes sense. I'm saying the way his testimony was developed didn't make sense. So to your point, I think $3,500 is really low for a man who gets paid $100,000 per episode, right?
Right.
And who supposedly was attacked by someone who works on the set who has a sense of how much he makes. But I didn't hear his lawyers develop it that way on cross-examination. The way you want to develop this on cross-examination is, look, if I make $100,000 per episode, I'm not fixing to pay somebody $3,500 to stage a hate crime that could result in me sitting in the seat I'm sitting in right now, right? Also, if you're going to talk about having an intimate relationship with someone, and even, I don't know why you volunteered doing drugs with this person, but if you're going to say that, then what you also need to indicate is this person thought I was going to hook him up either with a security job or by getting a job standing in the background on one of these shows. And when that didn't happen, he behaved the same way that every unrequited lover did, and he brought these false charges against me. But I didn't hear those themes actually get developed. I just heard a bunch of different details, salt and peppered, that I think is actually going to turn the jury more against him than in his favor. So I agree with your point, but it wasn't developed that way. You hear what I'm saying?
Developed that way. You should have been on the case. that's exactly. One last thing before you go. What do you think about the Jussie's attorney, who happens to be a Black woman, Tamara Walker, saying that the judge lunged at her and snarled during the sidebar?
You know, this is a hard one for me to answer, honestly, Clay, and let me tell you why. Do I believe that that happened during a sidebar? I absolutely can. I've seen judges behave ridiculously in court, and this is something that people struggle with when I talk to them about what it's like being a lawyer. If I'm walking into a courtroom as your lawyer and knowing that you're Black and I'm Black, I can't simply complain about the way the world works inside the courtroom. I have to first and foremost be your lawyer. And regardless of what goes on in that courtroom, I have to find a way to fight for you and defend you, because at the end of the day, me saying, Clay, this wasn't fair, this wasn't right, ain't enough. I have to be able to say, we fought the best fight we could possibly fight. And you have to find a way to push through all those things. And the reason I say that is because I know it's unfair. I know it's wrong. I know it's just. I know the deck is stacked against us, but we still have to be able to find a way to fight for justice. So do I believe those things happened? I have no problem believing that they have. I worked in a jurisdiction where there was one judge in particular who routinely would make people cry inside of his courtroom. But the problem is, if you're going to go in that courtroom and you're going to defend people, especially marginalized people, you have to be able to find a way to push past those things. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. I feel like no one's really talking about these key things that we brought up, and I have my own perspective. And, again, I do Exonerated every Wednesday, so I might just be traumatized because when I'm hearing prosecutors being threatened, when I'm hearing, I'm like, wait a minute, this one Black person in Cook County, it's just bizarre. But
now that's really a topic for next time, though, how easily it is, how easily we get struck from jury duty, because every single high profile case has one or two of us, with the exception of the Derek Chauvin trial, which was handled under special circumstances by A.G. Ellison. But that's an issue we need to talk about, is we make it easy for them to strike us, and we've got to get past that if we want to see more justice. But
David, if this can happen to rich, privileged Jussie Smollett, regardless of being guilty or innocent, but a witness being threatened, one Black person on the jury, a judge with a bizarre history, how does it affect somebody who doesn't have his money, who is poor, who has a public defender?
Yeah, it does. Like the criminal justice system. In fact, they asked me this question. Someone asked me a question about whether or not Bannon was going to get nervous by being charged for refusing to comply with the orders of the special inquiry based on January 6th. And, honestly, I didn't say it, but I'll say it to you. I think Trick Daddy said it best, and I'm not comparing Bannon to Trick Daddy or to an OG, but Trick Daddy said real OGs don't even take pleas. And the reason why is because people who know how the criminal justice system works and have access to adequate resources, and especially who are not people of color, don't have to be afraid of it. But it overwhelmingly relies on people either being inadequately represented or not represented at all. So what you're seeing play out in Jussie Smollett's trial happens in every single case where a person of color is on trial. And normally they don't even have the resources to get people to pay attention, let alone to have any semblance of a chance of getting justice. And that's why I say we can't pray for a world where the system is simply different. We have to find a way to fight for justice in the world as it exists right now. And that starts by finding a way to punch through all these problems. And I want to thank you for doing that, if only by having your presentation every Wednesday and by creating an environment where we can talk about these issues as they affect our community.
Well, again, I want to say, if Jussie Smollett is guilty, then he should pay for that. I don't think it should be jail time, but whatever that is. But I just want someone to get a fair trial. That's it.